Hey guys, it's Al from Altruistic Channel, and I'm coming to you with a little special video here. I don't know if many of you know this, but I actually have two channels. One is Al Altruistic Channels, or Avalo, which is my personal page, and that one deals more in depth with like ascension, the actual depth, the higher realms of the awakening process, and coming into spirituality from a higher perspective. And then Altruistic Channels, I always intended it to be much more polished and more of a professional website on YouTube. And so, lo and behold, as I was developing and changing and morphing according to my spiritual path, I was writing. And so, many of you know that I have already two books on Amazon. One is called A Dual Purpose, and then the second one, the middle child, one of my favorites, is A King with No Kingdom. And both of them are available over on Amazon. But the interesting part is I was finishing up my last book, this one, A New Ticket to Eden. And I decided that I would do something a little bit more unorthodox on this and actually share with you some of the first two or three chapters of the book so that you get a better understanding of where my mindset is because of what I'm about to tell you. So, as part of the spiritual journey of the spiritual pilgrimage, if you will, that I consider a graduate would go through, is basically surrounding the idea that you somehow master or come into a control level over the spiritual, emotional, physical, mental, egoish, and heartfelt. I call them the 5 points of light because two of them kind of run in tandem with each other, but technically I guess it would be six. And so once you do well by that, I guess apparently you graduate to some degree because mine came with a huge present, which was to annihilate and take away my entire life in a very dramatic, very Al-esque way. And as you can see, I'm laughing and completely like just in love with life in the process because it did it in a way that leveled my life. I mean, literally, every friend I ever had and I do not speak anymore. Anybody that I was going to keep kind of betrayed me. And then those that I do really love and do cherish can't help me. And so the next thing I know, I have no job, and then I can't get a new job, and then the money ran out, and now I have no unemployment coming to me. And so just to make it interesting, as a full present from the divine, I lost my apartment and ended up on the streets. And so the reason I'm smiling about it is because how can you ask for a brand new life or a better improved life if you are hanging on to the old one? So I got exactly what I asked for in a very, very unorthodox way. And so I have no one else to blame for it but me. And I can't because I'm just in love with the fact that I know I'm guaranteed now a brand new life. And it's a very clear message from the divine that I've done well. But it takes a minute for your mind to wrap itself around it. And so in order for everyone to better understand this process, I decided that I would finish up the actual book, the third. And because the next book is not going to be part of the same series. The next book that's coming will be more dedicated towards the actual path of what it looked like after the leveling, after the tower moment that brought everything crashing down, what it was to be rebuilt again by the divine as opposed to trying to kind of control it mentally, which is what we all do. You know, everybody wants to be in control of their life, but if we were doing that well, we would have needed the divine to keep interacting and kind of stepping in. So this time I've just decided to let it go. Like tomorrow I have no idea where I'm staying. I have no idea where money's coming from. I have no idea how any of it's going to work. I have a shelter for tonight with my dear friends, but you never outstay your welcome. And so I'm moving on tomorrow and I have no idea where to. And I'm kind of just letting the divine kind of guide me. And people are just very, very, very upset by the fact that I seem so nonchalant about it. I'm not. It's just that either you believe and you trust in the system, that there is something bigger and better than we are, or you don't, and you suffer through a victimized mentality for the rest of your life, thinking that nothing ever gets better. And so I choose to agree that there's something better there for me. Otherwise, why level everything so quickly and so dramatically? And so obviously I had to make sure I was looking at things from the right perspective. And so you're going to hear in the book right now that I'm going to begin to read, you're going to hear why I believe that I'm blessed as opposed to not blessed. And so this is kind of just a little sharing of the story of what you're going to be seeing in the book itself. And it's just something that I want to share on the basis that when you are truly blessed in this world, it is very hard for people who are living in a victimized mentality to understand what it's like to be given an opportunity and be so blinded by what your expectations are that you don't see the opportunity for what it is, which is a gold mine. And so it's always important for those of us who are in a better mental place for it to not let people tear you down by them saying things like, oh, you're delusional, you are, take the rose-colored glasses off, you got to think less of yourself, you can't have it all of that stuff. Because you start to notice at some point that the more you study spirituality and the divine, that there are no limits. There has never been a limit on us. In fact, we were handed Eden. It's the human condition to hallucinate and think that we are not capable of much more than we are. In fact, it's a very controversial aspect of the book where I kind of mentioned that burning bush that they were talking about wasn't a burning bush. It was a burning shrub. And that's what they were tripping on when they took the apple, because it wasn't an apple. Otherwise, why would God say, hey, who told you you were naked? That's hallucination. So it's the deviancy of the act that we are paying penance for. But the question is, at what point do we stop hallucinating and start to look for the real deal? And so removing limits is kind of where my mind is at. And I'm kind of in a very, very wonderful position where, although everybody's looking down at me and, oh, I'm such a bum and, oh, I'm not trying hard enough and all these things that just are so full of shit, that I'm just finding it more and more increasingly amusing that they actually are getting off on the fact that they think that they understand what's happening, and in truth they're farthest from the actual truth of it. And so I'm going to share with you where that ideology comes from, because it's something special that I was given as a gift by none other than the Holy Father. Someone who hasn't had necessarily a father, the fact that I've been so blessed to have God in my life is truly 100% a real blessing of God. And so I want you all to understand that when I speak to these things and you all look at me like I'm nuts or look down on me because I'm not sitting here letting it get me down, it's not an act, it's an actual thing. It's what happens when you realize when you look at the veils start to lift of reality and you start to question things enough, at some point you stop and you actually stop looking like a glance through the veils. You actually start looking at the cracks in the veils, and you're standing there with like one eye open and you're going, wait a minute. And then you see further and farther than others, and it's not boasting. And you start to realize the duality of all expression. One thing that can be true for you at one time, but if you raise your vibration, it's not true for you anymore. And so people who speak to the lower end of it don't know how to resonate with you at the higher end of it. And so it's an interesting place to be in. And so I wanted you all to hear, especially on Altruistic Channel, what the book is basically going to be about. Because the first 3 chapters are very, I think, a rewarding experience. And then there's some chapters in there that I bear the blade of truth, and it's a little uncomfortable at times. But it's something that's very important, because you cannot ever expect to ascend the madness and rise above it if you keep putting up with everybody else's hot air. And what do you do with hot air? You transfer it into helium, and you rise above it. And as everybody's making fun of you or talking down to you or saying shit about you, or you just sit there and you go, hey, oh my God, you look like ants down there. And it's not like an egoish thing. It's a moment of truth. And so the redemption in this is that it's a resurrection. It's basically, I gave myself over to service for humanity in the way that I've always believed in limitless possibilities and creating an Eden as opposed to judgment and in place for getting initiation, right? Like I'm always very proactive. But it took a very long time for me to get to this headspace. It wasn't like I was born like this. I was I'm a Cancer. I'm a Cancer by in like 4 aspects of my chart are all Cancer, and then 3 of them are all Leo rising or Leo, and I'm a Leo rising, so 4 and 4, and so it's a very interesting place to be, because somehow in this year I went from a full 100% indoctrination as a Cancer under the moon and being controlled by the moon in those aspects to completely almost 180 in at least 3 areas of my like my career, my way of thinking, and the general mindset of spirituality has all become Leo rising. So it's a very interesting place to speak from. So essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to read to you where this all is stemming from and what I believe is happening. So I hope you all enjoy this, and I hope you stay through the first 3 chapters. This will be available on Amazon within the next, I'd say the next couple days. So I'm about to hand you a ticket out of the cosmic marshes of Earth, but it will depend entirely on if you are willing to set aside any preconceived notions as to what's all happening around you. The Earth has embarked on its initiation into the sacred space of becoming one of creation's most sacred planets. Long has it been that we on Earth were under the impression of being under borrowed time, knowing that all the blind eyes to the corruption, the sex abuse of organized religions, the mental entrapments of illusion that surrounded our understanding of science's purposes and its misuse, as a means of limiting our ability to create without constraints, has now become more than apparent. Somehow, in the process, though, some of us were able to think beyond what was known and sense out the true reality just beyond the horizons of what the senses could ingest. Pioneers like Oprah Winfrey, Bill Gates, Angela Lauria, J.T. Fox, Jennifer Lopez, Katy Perry, Adele, Greg Braden, Beyonce, Leo over at Actualize.org, and Natalie at theartesian.com all began bringing us glimpses of genius in the fields they'd mastered, and with that, glimpses of what was possible for each of us. You see, to begin the story, we must address the shift that is occurring and how it affects the state of how you have been thinking about life. It's not that we are trapped in the bowels of limbo, or Hades, or in a state of redemption in which we must pass a series of tests in order to escape the stains left behind of a worldwide state of self-sabotageal mindsets. It's that we have been wired to believe that we have done something that merits such hardships. This is absolutely not the case, and so we need to let all that go in order to see the wisdom of what's to be said herein. The truth is that God, Allah, or whomever you subscribe to as our Creator was and is much more loving to us than we thought possible. And so, like most beings in creation, spent more time overcomplicating the situations laid out in front of us. It's not the dawning of Aquarius that's unfolding, it's the dawning of the Arc-Quarians, meaning we sit at the ending of the past leading into the future, but rather the years of absorbing the knowledge held within those parables is now upon us. Look at it, absorb what you can, make sense out of it as it applies to your life and general understanding, so as to let it all go and embark on the present as it unfolds into your future incarnations. Think of it in terms of universal creator working with our creator, the divine, to bring about the evolution of our soul's journey into a state of universal consciousness. We are creating the arcs out of the cosmic marshlands that we've been dubbed by the cosmic superpowers within creation, as it takes a special breed of energy to survive a space created only for the souls that have reached the pinnacle of graduation, cosmically. There will come a time in the not-so-near future where you will be shown the hardships and the true heartbreaks that our cosmic families endured in the beginning of time when we agreed to this assignment. Think in terms of being the parents of someone who has enlisted into service during a time of world war, all the while knowing that you will never see them again in your lifetime. As we arrived at this cosmic boot camp, if you will, its very nature changed our energies and in doing so deepened our presumptuous awareness of what's real and not real with each layer that was placed upon us. But the interesting part is that we all thought we were trying to survive the experience and would be handed some sort of reward when we did right by it. So it never crossed our proverbial minds that we instead had been handed a blank canvas from which we would have to face our innermost darkness in order to one day see the coloring lift and the new shades of divine light come into view. The irony is that the map has been in front of us the entire time and begins with the creation of Adam from the 16th chapel. It was in our receipt of the meaning that we lost sight of the warning it was and instead made it a fake memory from which we all sprang from. We were handed Eden, and we instead took it to mean then that it must have been a lost cause. Think in terms of, creation book. Every artist has, when they first are handed a blank canvas and told that this piece will define who they are as an artist. No one, and I mean no one, ends its creation where they first thought they'd begun it. But as Gaia faces untold harm that we have yet to align ourselves behind fixing, she was handed a form of immortality by the divine in the initiation. And so every one of you needs to take a silent moment of truth and thank her for maternally acting in agreement to the painful and sweeping changes that are now playing out. In her accepting the quote-unquote promotion, each of us now has access to the arcs of creation whereby we can escape and or, at the very least, send word to our truest cosmic families as to how we are and if we are indeed still alive in the physical state anymore. Time not being linear has moved a lot more than we think around cosmically, as after all, anyone who still thinks that we are alone in the cosmos is by definition truly insane. It's just forbidden to try and make contact with us, and it's so heavily protected that the divine knowing that at the heart of any living entity one cannot be dissuaded from checking on their babies, he/she even went as far as to make us unable to initially see or understand the presence of those who are not in a physical form. Side-eyed flashes, drunken states in which we catch glimpses of what cannot be, or drug-induced moments of veils being lifted, are all loopholes that divine infinitely handed us beams of hope have long since been said to be false by the same powers that create the new state of illusions we reside in. Think in terms of all the times you have been truly at hardship's door, where you said aloud that you cannot take any more, and that a miracle of some kind manifested itself into your consciousness. These are not accidental. They are the truth of what you are capable of, but has been eluding us for some time now. It's that we were again looking at it from a state of slumber, in which we really truly believed that we were trapped here on earth. Otherwise, you would have long ago realized that there is no such thing as accidental moments in life. All things have purpose and meaning. From the heaven above in the purpose of hurricanes to the reshaping of the planet by major earthquakes, everything is created to shake you out of a sense of comfort, then, isn't it? As a result, then, of all the hard work that the fringe thinkers of society have been doing since the Renaissance, our deepest hopes for humanity, as we call it, has been long since sending information back to the sun, the home of our understanding of creation. All things come from light, right? So what does this all mean to you as the reader? In a once-in-a-creation cycle existence, we have been handed the keys of evolution on a one-way ticket out of the marshes in order to process the next layer of consciousness, Eden. From the Bible being littered with astrological coordinates to each religion all telling us tidbits of needed clues as to who we all are, the universe is doing its best to scream at you to not believe the illusions around you. There's a massive boulder in front of our eyes that is impassable, and the reason is patience. Think back on the evolution of man and how it's taken thousands and thousands of years for enough of us to truly start questioning things around us, enough to start to break down the veils of what we think is consciousness and reality. So it is now the time of Earth's ascension into sacred space that the judgment we think is happening around us is not as it appears. You are not being called to a test for your lifetimes. You're being called to step up and see beyond the veils of what we call reason. And I don't want to hear anything about my being nuts. You all believe in a man in the cloud that watches over us and tells us what we can and cannot do. Meanwhile, the same office is over a state of organization that allows the victimization of children and then houses pedophiles within the same doors and then just silently relocates them to unsuspecting neighborhoods or third world countries that allow them to prey on other children. My patience with you people is out, isn't it? The truth is this. Either you are facing judgment that will see you face a delusional Heavenly Father that allows the victimization of a worldwide conscience, or you're being initiated into finally seeing the true face of a loving Creator that wants you to get out of poverty, a state of spiritual crisis, or even a state of empty abundance. Whichever will you choose? The arcs present your freedom, and it depends on if you can make the leap that is needed at this time. Are you a helpless victim in a slasher film? Or are you the soul that came here to prove yourself worthy of nobility, queenships, or kingships? If you are ready, then let's do this. Arcs are now leaving Earth, and I am personally helping you cross the bridge by foot if we must. That is my mission and how I've been realigned with my role in this ascension. Let's go, kids, as there are a lot of us getting out and making it home. And believe it or not, it's exactly on top of where you think you are at this moment. Don't trust me yet? Go for a walk in whatever major city you are in or whatever suburb you're living in and count how many lots are quote-unquote vacant, and then count how many of those are next to prime property of skyscrapers or huge developments and ask yourself, why are those lots the only ones not built on? Or is it possible that they already are? And I'm willing to bet that your super consciousness just sent shivers down the back of your spine, didn't it? It's time to go, y'all. We are just a small hike to where we are starting from. Take the empowerment. It's time to rise. Chapter 1, Creating the Arc Conscience. Let us begin this chapter by understanding what the arc is in reference to before I go deep into what I created for myself as an example. To begin, the arc begins with a map of your ancestors that is given to you once you have reached a certain level of awareness. It is your task, once it's been handed to you, to track down the easiest of all of your ancestors that you share the most with, and then research them as thoroughly as you can. If it is the right indication, you will share with them a slew of traits and noticeable characteristics that will let you know that they are indeed the right one. In no time, you should see that it was indeed not just a relative, but an earlier incarnation of yourself. To test this, go back through your family line to the 1500s and find a person that shares at least 5 things with you and you alone. These things can be anything ranging from your habits, like gambler, adulterer, teacher, musician, artist, and so on. And so once you identify the first shared aspect that is universal to both of you, a map of your past will begin to show itself, which will then lead you to the next person in your line that will also then share those exact traits. Before long, you should be dreaming or getting steered towards names that you do not really know, but that after you research it out in conjunction with your traits will produce a long list of your previous incarnations. Though it sounds a tad out there, I found it to be most rewarding and was able to track myself all the way back to before Christ. In all 12 incarnations, I had exactly 5 key aspects to who I am now that are shared in each previous case. Once you get over how your story ends, which took me a minute because in 2 I was beheaded, and in 1 I rode off in a chariot, which of course ties into the fact that 8 of my incarnations I was apparently always born in Cancer, and the others are questionable because they seem to have been born around the same time, but no document of it. Once you have all the information, you will be tasked with compiling as much data as is known about them, and then let the cosmos guide you from there. The point here is that you are to go as far back as you're allowed to pick up all the pieces about yourself that make you, well, you. It is then up to you how you use the information, but for me, I used it to further understand my soul's purpose, based on the houses I have and the 7 rays of enlightenment. Once I had my canvas, I was actually tasked before New Year's Eve to paint my canvas, and so I did so literally. I went ahead and created a list of people in my life that I could not do without, and listed why they were important to me. I was then quote-unquote asked, if you will, to make contact with them during the holidays and ensure that I spent as much time as I could and recorded the wonderful experiences with who they are. I was originally under the impression that since I had already been called to face judgment, and I do mean horn and everything, that I was not going to be allowed to make the transition and that I was finishing up all my timelines and tasks. To be honest, when I woke up still myself on the 1st of this year, I could have been knocked over by a feather. It is not a gentle process, this ascension, and more often than not can be brutal. But from what I can gather now on this side of things, it's that with my lists and my canvas, I stayed true to who I was and who I was meant to be. So much so that I even had to stand up against the divine on a couple of topics. Of course, these were tests that I had to endure, but I'll get into that once we get further into the space of what the call to judgment meant to me and to the seriousness of which I took behind it and its aftermath. Point is that I did wake up. And though I was so grateful, I was also severely unsure for how long I'd be allowed to stay. You see, there are 2 concepts to judgment. If you are called and come back, it means you don't get to go to heaven and are having to come back and do your best to make it on borrowed time. And the other was that you are already on your own personal hell by this point, and so you must fight for your freedom because we're too far off our own path. It would turn out to be a hodgepodge of both, really. But like I said, this is not the time nor the place to get into it in full. It was in the uncertainty that I would find my next clue. I was tasked with compiling my canvas and traits into my final submission as to my entire history for Ascension. And since as you know, I cannot disclose anything further on the nature of Ascension, let's just say that it was the beginning of the arc. You see, it's not that you are being tasked with the impossible task of picking and choosing what you want to transition with into whatever it was you created for yourself. It's that it must be in alignment with who you are meant to be to begin with. But the problem is, as many of you know already, the problem is that you don't really know what that is until you're this far into this particular ascension. For me, all 12 of my confirmed incarnations shared both theology and philosophy backgrounds. All were at some point lecturers or teachers, all shared some form of artistic expression, mostly painting or music, and all served God at some point either as a bishop, humanitarian, or spiritual leader, and so on. Every single one of them even went as far as to fill the role of what I would consider a hierophant in the tarot card, which threw me as I thought I was so weird for thinking I could do it this lifetime. Last but not least, almost all ended up building schools or academies or even created their own philosophical or theological societies. That includes the 2 times I was a woman, which I found beyond honorable. The one running theme was the deep need to fight for equality within the church and in society. In fact, both beheadings appeared to be because of this absolute law for quote-unquote us. The point is that you should find all of your traits, special interests, and quote-unquote tells within your history, and so I finally realized why. In order to ascend, you must transition through with all your parts. Not to make light of it, but more to prove a point, the Tibetan once made a statement that the masters would all have their teeth and then went on to describe in great detail the physicalities that a true chosen disciple will show. I'm not sure if it was the Tibetan or it might have been the Buddha, but I remember specifically that that's what the comparison was. Obviously, They went much more into detail than I can, but the point is that you need to know all your past lives in order to carry them with you into the new state of consciousness, as once you ascend, there is no going to the past anymore. This is about the present and making the most of it as you make it into your future. You're creating a brand new existence for yourself, including if you will even want to go on once you have mastered the mental, physical, and emotional planes. Remember, I call it initiation, but in truth, it's still Gaia becoming a sacred planet. We could be facing a form of extinction, or at the very least, the idea of it, as in the end, we know we don't all die, otherwise, why make us ascend? Many of you who are willing to face all these aspects of yourself, to tie up your karma, you will be doing so as a means to reach the new Garden of Eden. In fact, where I sit now is what I can only describe as the clear state in which I am being rebuilt. And what does that mean, you ask? Remember the Ark with all of our heroes, friends, and family that we compiled? Well, those aspects that are deemed to be best serving of who you are meant to be, well, that is what's being used on me now. What attracted you to those people, famous or personal, was either things you liked or did not like about yourself. So it is in fact what you will be facing now as you are remade into the newer version of yourself. It's scary as shit, but it's all full of a lot of frivolity. I think I have finally found the funny bone, and so I implore you all to transcend the madness as instructed, because on this side of things it's just downright darling and a little bit light-weighted. And then I'm going to conclude this with the second chapter as a teaser, and it's called Chapter 2, The Noah, the Type, and the Story Arcs. One of the scariest things about ascension is how limited we are on how this can all ever work out. In truth, we all must have realized at some point that both Jesus and the rest of the masters all ascended by first having to die and then being resurrected. How many of us are really truly willing to do that? I ask you. Lots of laughs. Well, I hope the answer is all of you, because that's exactly what's happening. First and foremost, let's begin building the story arc by wielding the sword of truth, by my sharing the pain is learned. When I underwent my death process the first time, it absolutely did not hurt. I remember being scared as can be, then it became me trying to be brave, and then feeling the physical process begin with a fire that was spreading throughout my body, almost like in Breaking Dawn by Stephanie Meyer, that I would quantify as being a part of the purification of one's soul. I just kept saying and repeat, quote, I am the light, I am the love, I am the process, being surrounded in God's love from above, unquote. It got me through it, but I should attest that it was not the first time, or the first encounter, I should say, with this terrifying process known as death. In total, I have died at least 9 times in variations, based on emotional, mental, ego, physical, and spiritual aspects to our current understanding of what human consciousness is. But as you can see, that still leaves 4 that I am not covering, and that's because it's not time yet. But I can add a hint to a couple which can be understood if you are an alchemist, but I digress. If you can't understand this section in full yet, then it's not meant for you at this time. This book is meant for those who have surpassed any limited mindsets of impossibilities, and usually not of their own accord either, mind you. But it's meant to help you further mentally wrap your head around the idea that you cannot face something and succeed if not first being open to what's all involved. If you have assets, then how can you ever truly expect to master anything? This is for those of you who are on the path that are still trying to make the transition and yet haven't gotten to possibly experience the worst of which was for me, was the death of the ego. I say that because most of us are born free of a self-centered lifestyle or narcissism, and so the struggle throughout our life in making a sense of the good, the bad, and the ugly of us. By the time that this aspect started to play out, I had ascended enough to finally have come into my full power of accepting it all, and finally was in love with who I'd become. So you can imagine how heartbreaking it was to watch it sacrifice itself in order for me to continue on. You see, you spend your life making excuses for the parts that make you color outside the lines, that make you dream so big that limited mindsets can't understand you or show they could ever care. So you spend it all alone in crowded rooms or in states of pretend love situations where you are nothing if not all alone always, while having to deal with someone else's crap, mind you. So finally, after decades of putting yourself in last place of priorities, you are tasked with accepting all of these faults and then mastering it in a state of grace, whereby you stand in full power, only to then let it all go and allow it to present itself for deconstruction, as it screams and cries and terrifies the truest part of you, because it's that true childlike aspect to who you are on the inside. And you know you will never see it again. When I say I cried and screamed for 2 days, I am not kidding. I was beyond heartbroken and so upset at the divine that I almost quit and ended it all. noteworthy on the idea of suicide. Don't ever do it. It appears that if you do that during the ascension, you are not allowed to ever come through again. It's a permanent, quote unquote, stuck on earth sentence. And as we stated, she is changing, so it may not be the best of situations to get stuck in. It's not just that you didn't overcome the things you were tasked with, as that's just physical. It's that you didn't even bother to ask the divine for their help. They do not take that level of sadness lightly, and so immediately will step in to alleviate the illusions around you. I think that they'd rather you give up and tell them you're giving up so that they can transition you out calmly and peacefully. But in truth, that is between you and your higher power in the end. Remember, death is just a doorway. It only hurts if you believe it will, which some would argue can be more so true in this regard. My pointing this all out to a person already thinking this way may help them reconsider their thinking, as after all, this is all just an illusion, and so it might be of help to anyone facing this kind of mental pain. In all honesty, it should be a lot easier to do it this way than even when you're called for judgment. For me, this was by far the most confusing aspect of the process, as it had no clear beginning or end to it. What I mean is that, compared to my birthdays, full moon eclipse, and cancer death, this was a piece of cake. You see, my ending began on July 2nd, 2019, when I suddenly got so sick that I was in agonizing stomach pains and was rushed to the hospital. Once admitted via ambulance, I was again told I was dying. But the staff there was so horrible to me that though I would have normally just done what I always do not always, but the three previous times and just gotten up in defiance to live another day, would not be something I could do this day. First off, they assumed that because I was so thin, I must be HIV positive, as clearly all gay men were to them. But they said it in such a way that I thought that they were informing me that I was. I immediately started sobbing because I didn't expect it. All things considered, I already had way too much going on, and so luckily, with God's grace, the ER doctor, who I didn't catch his name, heard me and came rushing to my aid. He asked me why that was shocking, and I explained that I tested negative not even 4 months prior, and so he promised to let me know immediately if I was truly positive this time. Thankfully, it was within an hour or so that he came back and personally informed me that I wasn't. I was then moved into the ICU after his brief quote-unquote meeting with the staff and was confined to a bed, so much so that it culminated in the single most inhumane moment of my life where I would be held down against my will and they made me shit all over myself. And so, despite the angel of a doctor, who, if I ever run into him again, I will not stop myself from offering my firstborn of his own making, no less, I made a heart-wrenching decision that I feel ultimately saved my life. I was degraded and heartbroken, so I made the decision to leave and go die in my own bed. They originally put up a fight, but when I threatened to kill two of them, they eventually saw it my way and I was allowed to leave, and I signed the papers. I don't condone violence, but I am sure many of you will understand if I actually had murdered either one of them, and so I would feel justified, but I digress. I had no one to call as my aunt was no longer at work so late in the evening, and so I had to walk all the way back in that conditioning to where I was staying at the time, which would be 5 miles. By the time by this point, I was so run. By this point, I was in a rundown motel that only those who experience a dark night soul and hookers would know all too well. But that to this day, I was so grateful to be living at because of the manager there, who had a heart of a champion and saw through the veils of my loserdom to the man that's writing this book now. In fact, as of the writing of this book a week ago, I was still there. Obviously, now I'm not, but that's a different story. I digress. I had lost a week's pay at the time and had no food, and as I laid there, could not pay my rent. I finally had grown so upset and despondent about it all that I started to pray for death with each passing day, and about 2 months in, I got my prayers answered. From time to time, I was so in pain from not having any meds because I had left against doctor's orders that I started to cry regularly, and one night I fell asleep in the process. I was then startled when I heard the loudest horn I'd ever heard blown over my ear, that it stopped my heart and cold. It just stopped it dead. It would not come back on to pulsing for a good 10 minutes at least. I was so surprised that I was then jolted onto a boat, where maybe there were 20 other people on it, when the window broke and me and the other two in my aisle were sucked out into some sort of sea of souls. The other two went right under. I was barely able to keep my head above water, and so imagine my surprise when out of nowhere I see a train come from underneath me and under the water, full of a bunch of white Anglo-Saxon faces beaming ever so brightly as they headed upwards into what I assumed was heaven. Obviously, I didn't make the cut, I thought, and so was shocked to then be finding myself in a tunnel of white light. I can't tell you what I saw looking back at me, as it will vary, I am told, for each of you, but it caused a sense of peace to come over me. I was able to think and was asked only two things. How did I feel my life went, and did I have any regrets? I didn't say anything as felt that they understood my thoughts, but remember thinking I was proud of my life. I had been honest, had integrity, tried not to complain, and found humor to be my savior almost the entire time. But when I got to the regrets aspect, I realized I had never experienced love. Since my mother and father were not together, I really hadn't grown up with any type of role model in that way, I thought. So I instinctively realized how sad that made me, and for some reason that made me physically want comfort, and so I reached out to him/her or it. It reached back to me, and a jolt of electricity went through my body so quickly that it left a scar on my thumb, which is still at the very top here. That's how I know that I'm almost out of the phase, by the way, not in the book, but it is because it's almost grown out, so it's time for me to move on. The next thing I knew, there were suddenly all these tiny little metal hands wrapping around me as I heard the sounds of tick, tick, ticking, with each one of them guiding me all the way back into my freaked out body. When I was finally back in, I was jolted up with a sudden sharp pressure in the heart and was freezing to death. I immediately was like, what the fuck just happened? I suspected what it was in truth, but it would be the person on YouTube named Natalie who was doing her morning reading that would first say it outright, when she channeled that we had indeed been called to judgment and that she was so sorry it appears that we didn't make it if we were back. And later that same morning, it would be the man I was falling for at the end there, who grew up Baptist, that shared the news again with me, but after hearing my dream, that would ultimately confirm what I already knew. Twice was too much to be coincidental, and so I got the impression that I was meant to finish up what I was working on, and that it would be much easier for me the next time. I somehow knew that I was given 6 months, and so we now return to the January 1st, 2020 deadline I mentioned briefly before. In truth, I wish I could say that I was all that upset, but I honestly wasn't. I had been kicked so much in my life that parts of me had begun dying off each time I had to keep getting up, and so finally that stuff that happened at the hospital sealed it for me. I was ready. I texted my cousin and close friends and didn't say what happened, but just told them how much I loved them, each before I closed out my book and finished up my goodbyes. It had been a super hard life, and though I was a survivor, I suddenly realized that it was that which most held me back. You see, as the 6 months wrapped up, I had been tasked with researching and working my ass off to try and make right alignment with God's will, and as I did, I became consumed by it. I went days and days without sleeping, and so I worked my ascension. I started to take account how often I referred to myself as a victim. How are we ever supposed to ascend the madness if we constantly see the world as being something to overcome? How can we expect to be wealthy if all we do is focus on being poor, against despite always going above and beyond what was tasked of us? You can't. So I spent the last 3 months completely realigning my mindset, and so every day I forced myself to be joyous. After all, I had been given 6 months to finish things, right? I took walks every day, I learned to sing, I tracked down all of my closest relatives, and I made peace with my father not being there my whole life. My being raped as a kid by a man who emulated Jesus Christ to gain our trust as young boys, survived a cult of Scientology, which would be the eventual cause of my mother's death, and the death cause of my soul 10 times over as an early teenager, all by the time I was 26. But it was in facing all these shadows that I was able to start to sing every day, start to pray every day, and never again blame anyone or for anything in my life or how it was playing out. I found my calling, and it was amazing. I didn't even mind the ending coming. You see, as I got closer to Christmas, I became more distant to friendships and instead observed each one of them from afar. I allowed them to be who they were and started cutting names off my list, and with that sort of truth that I've been handed during Ascension. I even saw the truth of all the ones that I was keeping, though it was only a handful, mind you, with all of their faults and still loved them anyway. As I spent Christmas Eve preparing for the unknown, I realized that in the past year I'd overcome all my anxieties, had become a public speaker for the new spirituality and the collective movements, and in doing so stepped into a sort of community father figure archetype. Then I went into full gear with the books and my YouTube altruistic channel and altruistic channels Aravalo, making myself a form of holy man as it was always done in tandem with God, which in and of itself made up for the cult and giving me back a form of spirituality within the form of consciousness. Lastly, I even studied all the workings of Jesus Christ and would find solace in his parables, so much so that I was not ever angry at the rape again because it became clear to me that even subconsciously those two individuals were not anywhere of the same making. Ascension made me into someone amazing. So as New Year's Eve came to pass, my story arc had shown me how far my archetype had changed, and so I was okay with now getting onto what I dubbed Noah's Ark. It was time. And then the ball dropped at midnight. After an impromptu excursion, I said my prayers, didn't say a word to anyone I loved, and just closed my eyes with one last thought. Quote, I surrender myself in full to the process. I am not scared or unsure. I am the same honest, loving, reliable, God-serving, and integral person I've always meant to be. Unquote. And then I squeezed my eyes, sensing God all around me, and just let go. And that's the first 3 chapters of the book, guys. I hope you enjoyed that. It'll be coming out this weekend on Amazon, I believe. I was going to shop it around, but all things considered, since no one ever really helped me, and this is not a complaint, no one actually ever, I asked my friends over and over again to help me with the first 2 books to edit it, and no one ever did. And so I was begrudged at it at first because I was just like, well, what the fuck? Nobody wants to help me with it. I'm just asking them to proofread it. And I realized it was because at the end of the day, no one but me can take credit for my accomplishments in this life. And with my having written those books and it being in my verbiage and being, grammatically incorrect at times, it did not change the fact that it was true and it's going to be teaching a lot of wonderful things to a lot of great people. And so even though my friend now is trying to tell me to shop it around, unless that lands in my lap, if someone is interested in this book, I'm going to do what I did with the previous 2 and close out the trilogy of my own hands. Because in the end, no one can ever say that my kingdom that I'm creating is anyone else's but mine that way. So there you go. That's the story of where this is all coming from. I hope you guys get a better understanding of why I think the way I do. And I hope you guys continue to like, subscribe, and share my videos. Also keep in mind that I'm also has the Al Altruistic Channels Araballo and Altruistic Channels, 2 separate entities that are on YouTube. Also, the books are available on Amazon under Al Araballo, and I am still in this state of graduation. So if you would like to donate anything to help me in this project, by which we're going to start to unveil some of the elders and people that I find to be truly noteworthy, people who have seen hell and high water as the chosen, who are now about to step into the light with magical abundance and things that we've never seen in this world, and especially to help me out, obviously, with my living situation and with just having a place to lay my head as I make this journey, a spiritual journey at that, and or help me with food, please go ahead and email me at Kahmoos, KAHMOOS, at MSN, and I will private info you my information to Western Union or something. I don't know. As you can see, I'm not very comfortable with ever asking anyone for any help, but it's something that I've been tasked with by the divine. It's just another part of the ascension process. I am one of the most blessed people on this planet, so please understand that there's no ego involved here. This is about raising the vibration of humanity and helping to share some of the wisdom that I have luckily been graced with. And so though it may seem like I'm down on my luck, I'm about to be handed the keys to Eden, and all of you are going to be coming with me. So that's it for me on Alan Altruistic Channel. I love you all. Have a blessed night. And again, if you would like to, please like, subscribe, or share these videos. And I appreciate it, as I have a feeling it's going to grow really quickly. The divine is at my wings and helping me along the way. I don't know where I'm going to be tomorrow night. I don't know how I'm going to eat or get through it, but I know I will because I am living in His grace, or her grace, or its grace. That's one of the great things about ascension and awakening, is that you are never alone. Anyway, that's it for me. Bye.